Well, hello. As you could get from the title, this is The Problem with Shadowlands and How to Fix It by an aspiring game writer. Now, for me, I am studying to become a game writer. I like games a lot and I want to be able to write really interesting and good stories and whatnot. And for me, at least, I want to do this also by examining other stories and see what the issues are for them, how to avoid them, and also what is the actual like substantive reasons you can fix them. And before we begin, I want to state this one thing, a few things actually, is that I'm not gonna go at the individual line by lines because the problem with Shadowlands, at least to me, is not necessarily the actual line by lines problems like, oh, they misspelled a letter, or oh, they were grammatically incorrect, or whatever. That isn't what the issue with Shadowlands in my eyes is actually. The issue is more structural, and which the next thing I need to preface as well is that the writing isn't the problem, it is the execution of the writing. The idea of the jailer being a puppeteer of puppeteers isn't terrible. And what I mean by this is that any ideas, concepts, or whatever is in Shadowlands isn't a negative. It isn't a, oh, this is a definite bad thing. Because again, they can be done well and can be done poorly. They're being judged on the quality of them, not the fact that they're an idea and that it exists or it has been done before. It just matters on if they're done well. And so, as I shown by these two examples, the Lich King and Sargeras, I essentially saying that these two relationships are that Sargeras was a puppeteer who manipulated the undead to help conquer Azeroth, and so that he may destroy Azeroth. And that is set up really well, but I'll get into that details more later. But simply just to say that the reason why I mention this is that whatever ideas in Shadowlands is I'm not talking about is the problem. Again, it's more on a structural basis, which leads into the next one, which is motivations, setup, slash continuation, recontextualization, slash retconning. Now, each of these ones are interconnected in a lot of ways. What are the motivations of Zoval and Sylvanas? Well, it's complicated because it required a lot of recontextualization and retconning for the motivations. And then you get into the setup, which is okay, what is the setup for this? Which also needed retcons and recontextualizations for it to work. And a lot of that is all interconnected, and I will be talking about it all interconnected, but I want to also talk about another thing, which is the recontextualizations slash retconning. So World of Warcraft and Warcraft in general has had a lot of these throughout its 20-year or I think 10-year lifespan, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, and what I also wanted to point out as well, the same reason why I pointed out the previous one, which ideas aren't inherently bad, it's just how you do them, is that same thing with retconning and recontextualizations, is that they're not bad inherently, it's just how you go about them, which leads to Targaryen again. The first the first motivations for Sargeras were he went mad when he found out the void existed. That the void corrupting another planet and making it all voidy, and essentially making the Titan within it to corrupt it and to do the opposite of what the Titans are doing, drove him mad. Now, this does a lot to set up the Void as a huge antagonist in the cosmological battles, because if these beings of another sort are so fearful of them that they can go mad, and Sargeras being the strongest out of all of them, being mad because of the existence of it, terrifies him, causing him to go down his path of the Burning Legion and just destroying everything, does a lot to set that up. But the retcon that in the next one, which is he didn't go mad immediately, he went to go to his peers to say, hey, these void fiends exist and they're going to destroy the entire universe and nothing will ever exist because of them. We should wipe the universe clean, and whatever comes out of it, we can monitor, observe, and ensure the void will never have a foothold ever again. And this does a lot to have story potentials, later story potentials, and also a better characterization for him and the Titans. Because before the retcon, we didn't really get a lot on Titans. We did get a lot of on Titans, but in this one, there's a direct interactions and direct conflicts and interpersonal plays that are happening. A lot more can be done with this. And what the negative happened is that the void is now lessened. You know, it's not as terrifying as before, where just the idea of them, just the sight of them, drove Sargeras mad. But in the new lore, which is now old lore technically because Shadowlands retconned it, I think, um, is now just he didn't really go mad, but he saw it as a threat and took steps to do it. With the Dreadlords manipulating as well, but that's not as and again that's technically also a retcon from Shadowlands. It's complicated, but that's why I'm going to talk about it later, and why I was talking about good retcons like with this one in this case. And again, Sargeras is in the new version or old version now is a good example of good retconning because it not only adds more characterization for him, the Titans, and additionally a lot more better motivation for the Void, and not for the Void and for the Burning Legion and whatnot, that it makes more story potentials more interesting and more likely instead of the previous one. So now we get into the next bit. So, motivations. What are the motivations of Zaval and Sylvanas? So, for Zaval, the motivations is a bit unclear. Not totally, we have no idea what he's doing, but in a sense of that's like the general idea. And why a lot of people kind of didn't really accept the motivations of him is because of the build up and the hype of him. He's this massive manipulator who has been doing this for eons, for 10,000 years. He's been manipulating all the cosmological forces to get to this point in time. So having very simple motivations as I want to unite the universe or I want to destroy the universe isn't really good enough because what that leads the player is that the more effort a villain does to get their plans into motion, the more likely they will expect a more complicated motivation out of them because that is the level of expectations that have been built up because of that. And for Sylvanas, it's also complicated because the way they describe it is that Sylvanas is either being manipulated or is just doing this because she wants to destroy everything and her life's been terrible and that's why. This is very complicated because while there are evidence for both interpretations, there's not enough evidence to point out to one clear one. And the reason why this isn't really great is that when you're dealing with a story like Warcraft, which I don't necessarily think is the most complicated thing in existence, you do have to have clear motivations of why your villains do anything. And having these interpretations upon interpretations doesn't really suit what it is what it has been in the past, nor what it is trying to do now. And it definitely confuses the players and makes them just not really want to engage with the story at all. It disengages them, and that's the worst thing you could ever do in any game or any writing medium at all, is having your audience disengaged. Because when they're disengaged, it doesn't matter what happens afterwards. It doesn't matter how great it is. That disengagement makes any sort of connection with the story to the player or to the viewer or to the reader or whatever just null and void. And so these are the problems with the motivations, is that they're unclear from the start and that they're too complicated, or they seem to be too complicated. They have the appearance that there's more behind it. Again, Duvall being this massive manipulator that has been planning his whole thing for 10,000 years, and Sylvanas always suggesting and saying that there's more behind what she's doing makes what her actual motivations is pretty poor. And now we get to the setup plus continuation. So I'll talk about the continuation first because World of Warcraft has been going on for I think 10 years plus. And when you have a franchise that's been going on for 10 years plus, there's a sort of reluctance to have anything new, but also a reluctance to have anything just old. Because when you have a series that has been gone for any length amount of time, there's a sort of core to it, and then there's a sort of resistance to having just sticking to the core. And so Shadowlands is very simply like a Sargeras motivation, where he wants to destroy the universe because there's a greater threat beyond all of them that they need to unite together, either by their will or will suffer and die because of it. And so that both is okay, but also not okay for a lot of players. And this is the problem that is for any story that is for a franchise that has lived as long as Warcraft. And there's not really a lot to fix it, so I'm not going to really continue it. But I continued speaking about this topic. But I do just want to say that this is a problem that is very hard to handle, other than just making the current ideas, even if they're repeated ideas, good. That's all the solutions you can offer to this sort of problem. And now to the setup, which we have these two, the Undead and the Burning Legion. Now, why I pointed this out is because they set up the Burning Legion really well in Warcraft 3. So in Warcraft 3, when you start the game, you start as Arthas. You go around, kill some villagers. You do what you do, And as you do that, you find orcs, and they look a bit demonic. And then you go to the next area where they're doing a demonic ritual. So this immediately tells the player that there is some demonic force, that they are an existing power within the universe, and that they should be that the player should be aware of. And then we get the undead a few missions afterwards. And when we get the undead, it's not like, okay, cool, the undead exists as well. But there's no connection drawn between these two. Demons are not really related to the undead, and the undead aren't really related to the demons. Not that there is no connection, but the connection is very small and could be just chalked up to they're both technically doing the same thing, destroying everything around them. And to the player, this makes them aware of both of these forces and have a okay, I can understand why each of them exist and whatnot. And then later on, when they have the reveal that the Burning Legion are connected to the undead because they created them so they could soften up Azeroth so that they could invade it and destroy it, this to the player is natural, it's accepted, and there's no questioning about it. It's just, alrighty then, I get that, and move onwards. While for Shadowlands, this isn't the case. There is no setup to Shadowlands because the setup is a lot of off interpretations that you have to make some serious leaps of logic to try to understand. While within this one, it's very simple. You know who the undead are, you know who the demons are very early on in the game. And then when you find that out and they make the connection between the two, the demons made the undead, and the undead serve the demons for a very specific purpose. It's accepted and that's it. But for Shadowlands, that's not the case because the setup is so poor that when it happens, the players rejected because they didn't know it was going to happen. And this doesn't necessarily need to be spelled out in blood all across every single story that, oh, Shadowlands exists or whatever. But they did it so sublimely in Warcraft 3 that I feel like something was missing within Shadowlands that kind of could have made it better because a lot of the times the problems that people have with new villains or whatever is sort of a lack of proper setup, and that is could have been relieved if they had better setup with it. So setup was a huge issue with Shadowlands as well. So, for example, they when they killed Zul'jin and Zul'jin named Sylvanas war chief, okay, what was the reason for that? Players did not know why Zul'jin did that for a long time, and in the novelizations of Legion, Sylvana says she doesn't like the fact that she's being the war chief. She doesn't want to be the war chief, which is later retconned to have some setup about it, which now leads me to the recontextualizations and the retconning. So, as I said prior, multiple times, it's not a bad thing. Doing these things aren't bad. It just depends on how you use them and what the benefit is to do them versus the negatives is. And so, in this case, there's no benefit for the whatever retcons they did, because retconning Sylvanas's whole motivation in favor of setup isn't really good because, again, it creates player disengagement. People don't want to interact with your story if they feel like whatever they have been doing and consuming is just nothing, that it's just going to be useless. And especially because it's not really good retconning and good recontextualizations. Another one is, for example, the whole Sylvanas burning Teldrassil. That whole thing is just okay. So why did she do it? Because she wanted to. There was no setup. There was no idea of why Sylvanas did that. There was no grander idea. It was just she committed the genocide because she's the villain. But now there's a retcon that she did that so she could fuel the maw and be able to free the jailer. That explanation, while I don't think would have made the burning of Teldrassil better, I think would have made it more tolerable to the player base because it's like, okay, so there's a reason. There's a substantial reason other than Sylvanas is just doing this because. And that's also a terrible thing because Sylvanas just wanted to be a terrible person isn't a bad idea. It just needs, again, setup, motivations, and also the characters need to react to that. It felt like the burning of Teldrassil should have had a much more bigger knee-jerk reaction from the Horde than it should have been. Because a genocide isn't necessarily something like the Tauren or the Trolls, the Pandaren, and to a lot of the extent the orcs would not want because a lot of them aren't really warmongering. The undead would probably not like it, but they'll still stick with Sylvanas. And that's one of the issues with it. And for Zaval, the entire universe has been retconning to warp around his motivations and setup. Why did Sargeras do what he did? Because Zaval manipulated him, not because Sargeras was in a real vulnerable moment and was taken advantage of by other forces so that they can have their own agenda pushed. But it was simply Zaval did it. That's it. Why did Arthas become the Lich King? Zaval did it. Not because he was being taken advantage of by other forces for his love for his people. No, because Zaval just did that. A lot of the retcons aren't substantial. They don't make anything better. They just simply ruin a lot of previously really great stories. And that's the issue with retconning in its entirety, is that it does have the huge risk of disengaging your player base. And that then leads me to my last and final problem with it. It's an MMO. Now, there's not a lot to say or to fix about this, is that Warcraft being an MMO does detract a lot of its ability to write stories, especially because as an MMO, it's constantly updated, which means it's a forever game. You can't really have an ending, a definitive ending. And additionally, the way Warcraft has its own MMO experience is that it's either a year to 6 months for you to get an ending. The ending that was given for Shadowlands was waited for like I think 6 months. That's a long time for your player base to just stay with the story, especially if the story isn't really that great. And that's a problem uniquely tied to MMOs. There's not a lot of solving that issue, but there are ways to do it, which leads me to then the solutions for me. Have their motivations be clear. So one way they could have done this is that they could have, if they planned at the start, and which is the entirety issue of Shadowlands, is that they never planned anything. So Vol was literally created the last minute. Sylvanas' motivations were literally made last minute. But if they did plan this out, the solutions would have been have their motivations be clear, make it understandable what Zavol wanted at the beginning. And what I also then leads to the retconning is that have the jailer break free at the start of Legion, meaning he's not influencing the events of every antagonist since the beginning. Because one of the issues with his motivations is because of the amount of just retconning setup that was done that just made it very hard to take seriously. That, like, oh yeah, you just want to unite the galaxy under your domain, universe, I mean, under your domination, because then you'll be able to fight against this larger threat than the void, the light, or any of the cosmological forces. Because it'll give a more realistic understanding of, like, okay, so he recently just got out. He recently was starting to break free. And now he's, starting to manipulate things. Now, this does contradict a lot of things, such as like with the Narazim and Revendreth as entirety, but I think they could still just have the the dreadlords just do whatever, just make as much chaos as they can, because if they make more chaos, more people die, more people who haven't repented died, and which means gives Revendreth more anima, essentially. I think they could still have that because it doesn't seem like the guy really much just cares, other than just drinking his red liquid wine. And then there's also the setups, which is make them all integrated into the previous expansions. So make it when Zul'jin dies, name Sylvanas War Chief, have a very small quest or a very small cinematic, having a very like, okay, cool. So there's a clear connection between Zul'jin making Sylvanas, the War Chief, and with the jailer, which makes it okay. So we expecting something to happen in the next few expansions. Okay. Another example of this would also be within Battle for Azeroth, Sylvanas' motivations, have her be manipulated, have her have some sort of losing her own will to the jailer and whatnot. So it doesn't feel like Sylvanas is doing a 180 to a character, but that she is being manipulated by forces far stronger than her. And then we do have the last one, which is also a bit of a non-answer, but make a single player game maybe, which isn't likely at all, but that is at least a way to fix a lot of the issues with having to with an MMO live experience. So yeah, that is the problems of Shadowlands, and thank you. Enjoy the Black Void, as it were, and I hope this allows you to understand some of the reasons I think the problems are. And if you do have anything that I've gone off basis, do tell, because I would like to improve. Have a nice day.